In the early 90s, fresh from having watched the juggernaut that is Terminator 2 on our dinky 21-inch family CRT television, I asked my parents if we could rent the original movie on VHS from our local video rental shop. My parents stayed up together later that night, vetted the movie, and decided that despite a great deal of violence, dread, gore, and a somewhat awkward yet warm and earnest bonking scene, that yes, I could watch James Cameron's 1984 classic, The Terminator. And I'm glad they let me watch it, because I maintain that this movie is a masterpiece. What's the difference between Terminator 2 and the original Terminator? It's true that Linda Hamilton has transformed from beautiful, bumbling, Pat-sharp enthusiast into sinewy, granite-jawed mother of the future. But the most fundamental difference is that T2 is a sci-fi action movie, and a great one at that, and The Terminator is a horror film. Andrei Tarkovsky, visionary director of majestic and occasionally turgid movies like Stalker, Solaris, and Ivan's Childhood, amongst many others, had this to say of The Terminator. The brutality and low acting skills are unfortunate, but as a vision of the future and the relation between man and his destiny, the film is pushing the frontier of cinema as an art. So what's it all about then? Well, I'll let this man explain.
It wasn't so much a theme as a kind of seminal image. I was in Rome. I was broke. I had a high fever, and I was just having these weird dreams. And I had this image of this kind of chrome skeleton, death image coming out of a fire, kind of phoenix-like. And I just got up and sketched it. And then around the nucleus of that, I started to create a story and sort of backfill. Okay, what is it? Where did it come from? Who's it after? And it all sort of fell into place fairly quickly.
What the term visionary really means is anyone's guess, really, but in this case, maybe James Cameron meets the hazy criteria. The purity of that single terrifying image, the metal man, a technological nightmare rising out of the flames, an indestructible humanoid figure without pity, without remorse, without fear, relentless, unfeeling, and ungodly powerful, is now woven into the fabric of our culture. The character was supposed to be an infiltrator, physically nondescript and not memorable, though somewhat sinister because of his emotionally blank affect. In this spirit, Lance Henriksen, an awesome and slightly terrifying actor in his own right, was cast for the role initially. But as we all know, of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger ultimately ended up playing the Terminator, and it's very hard to imagine anyone else in the part. His performance in this movie is an example of the potential of great physical acting. It's as though Schwarzenegger was designed in a lab to play this iconic character. Of course, the Austrian oak is absolutely fucking massive in this movie, but there's far more to it than that. He and Cameron, by all accounts, were meticulous about the way the Terminator moved, targeted, and pursued his prey. People knock Schwarzenegger's acting chops, of course, but I think there are actually very few people who could have been so utterly convincing in this role. Physical acting is often unfairly dismissed, in my opinion. For whatever reason, it seems to be the commonly held belief that what you are saying is more important and somehow more difficult, and in some sense Apollonian, than what you are physically doing. Physical acting is regarded as more base, uninvolved, and easier. I don't share this sentiment. Schwarzenegger is fantastic in this movie, despite saying very little indeed. And if you think that any old muscle-bound chowderhead could inhabit the role of the Terminator as Arnold does here, then I think you're wrong. Arnold is one of the most professional people I've ever worked with. He has incredible concentration, he takes physical direction like no other actor I've ever worked with. He really understands the idea of how to move and how to work with the camera. It took me a long time to figure out what made Arnie so particularly fucking awful to look at in this movie, apart from his size, relentlessness, and all-around hyper-masculinity, of course. Then a few years ago, I noticed that he actually gets his eyebrows burned off when he gets flung from the car during the first alleyway chase. And as we all know, people without eyebrows are fucking terrifying. Even before he gets all his flesh burned off, Arnold looks alien in this movie, and I think the eyebrows are key. Well, that and the hideous flesh wounds to his face, engineered quite magnificently by Stan Winston. That makeup is just miraculous. For all its horror, action, and spectacle, Terminator is also the actually rather sweet story of two vulnerable characters meeting, caring for and protecting one another, and sharing a brief, tragic romance. Despite the occasionally hammy dialogue, there is a genuine earnestness and a sweetness to their fleeting relationship. Sarah and Reese are outsiders, two sensitive, vulnerable people. Both are bewildered by and alienated from the world they find themselves in. In the opening scenes, Reese is flung from some warbly electric-y timehole thing and slaps down hard onto a slab of grimy Los Angeles asphalt, naked, alone, and desperate. Sarah seems almost as lost in time as he is, as she bumbles her way through a dead-end job and struggles with her anemic love life. I mean, come on, how could you stand up a woman with that hairdo? Linda Hamilton is of course great as Sarah Connor. She plays the character not as a damsel in distress, but as a sweet, vulnerable character who grows as the film progresses. And by the end, she's strong, savvy, and taking ownership of her life. As she lifts Reese from the floor in the final scenes, we see that their roles have by this point almost reversed, and ultimately she's the one who destroys the Terminator. And as for Reese, well, as a kid, I wanted to be Kyle Reese. The sawn-off shotgun and the trench coat are pretty easy to get my hands on, but those Night Vandal high tops, and I think I probably need to raid a VO5 manufacturing plant to obtain that kind of volume in my hair. But I digress. Kyle Reese is played by the excellent Michael Biehn. I think I'm saying his name right there. It goes without saying that he's not your typical 80s action hero star. Reese is strong, sharp, and pragmatic, but crucially, he also carries an air of vulnerability about him. And it's this quality, I think, that makes him so relatable and so engaging to watch. He's an honest, sympathetic, somewhat troubled, and ultimately tragic figure. I'm kind of paraphrasing Cameron here, but to me, Kyle Reese embodies the most positive aspects of masculinity. First and foremost, he's a protector, pitting himself against the psychotic masculinity of the Terminator. He's someone who makes a great sacrifice for his loved ones and for something greater than himself. In some scenes, he's almost like a manic street preacher at times, making dire prognostications that are laughed off by the powers that be, shortly before the powers that be get dead. Here's a quote from J.G. Ballard that I think applies to this movie. Civilized life, you know, is based on a huge number of illusions in which we all collaborate willingly. The trouble is we forget after a while that they are illusions, and we are deeply shocked when the reality is torn down around us. One of the elements that makes this film so massively satisfying to me is the pains it goes to show how fragile, superficial, and complacent our society and institutions often are. Take these absolute gonads in the Technoir Club, for example, dancing inanely in ludicrous outfits as a grand battle for the future of humanity takes place right beside them, blissfully unaware, until they get shot. Or take the characters in the police precinct, played brilliantly by Lance Henriksen, Paul Winfield, and Earl Bowen. While the criminal psychologist is a complete cunt, the police officers themselves are generally well-meaning, and even sympathetic at times, but they're ultimately ill-informed, complacent, and ineffectual, and they're swept aside like leaves as the Terminator hunts down his target with grim relentlessness. There's a somewhat uncomfortable satisfaction in watching the Terminator waltz through Los Angeles, taking whatever he wants and sweeping aside anything or anyone in his path. Although of course we're terrified and appalled by him, we're also drawn to the character of the Terminator. and to a certain extent we identify with him. The Terminator does exactly what it wants to do at all times, and nothing will stand in its way. To quote a certain cream cheese spewing android, unfettered by conscience or delusions of morality. It's an aspect of ourselves that we quite rightly never act out in public, but at some just about unconscious level, I think there are times when we're all tempted to do so.
It's not really about machines from the future. It's sort of about our relationship with technology, but it's really kind of about how our human potential for dehumanization ourselves. You see cops as examples, and then the other idea that not to trust technology and even not to trust the fabric of reality, because by the second film you've got this woman who's gone crazy, knowing that the world is a completely fragile place and it's all an illusion. It can all be torn away by this nuclear war. And I was sort of playing with that in the first film as well. There's this war, it hasn't happened yet, but if you know that, everything changes and all your priorities change. Ideas like that. And I think that comes from being a kid in the 60s. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, clearly having these kind of fallout shelter, how to make a fallout shelter in your house, like that wouldn't do any good.
As a kid, I loved the film for its action, its intensity, its science fiction, and its warm and identifiable characters. But as I've got older and I've had to make my way through the cold, cynical, decadent, and oftentimes ludicrous whirligig that is modern life, I've come to see the film as a kind of ally of sorts. Sometimes when I watch this film and it catches me in the right mood, it serves as verification that yes, I am right, the world really is as idiotic and meaningless as it appears to be. If, like me, you've ever walked through the built environment of any advanced economy and felt only a sense of alienation, confusion, and mild dread, I'm sure you too can find something to relate to in this film. This was the first film directed by a young James Cameron. If his Wikipedia entry is anything to go by, he sounds like he was a bit of an outsider himself. The son of an electrical engineer and a nurse, a former truck driver and janitor who never finished college and wrote in his free time, who gave himself a college-level education in film technology by photocopying books in a local library before jimmying his way into the film industry. I dare say this film reflects the cut of his jib, at this time at least, and I'm sure we can see quite a bit of Cameron's self-image in the character of Reese, and maybe even of the Terminator itself, as he moves through the streets, deracinated and dishevelled, hot-wiring cars, and struggling to push his way through a decadent, witless and obstructive world. Many of the activities the characters get up to in this movie seem not too far removed from the guerrilla-style tactics they had to employ to get the film made. The film was shot mostly at night around Los Angeles, and usually without permits. Cameron tells us about one night where they dripped acid onto Arnie's jacket to simulate smoke, and then had him sneak up on a car and punch through the window. From the shotgun blasts in the club, to the scene where Reese attempts to cave the Terminator's skull in with a crowbar, the sense of crunching, hulking weight in the action scenes is another aspect of this movie that's absolutely crucial. I struggle to think of another Hollywood action scene as brutal and deadening as the police station rampage. It's also another aspect that's absent in the more recent films. T2 somehow one-upped the original in the action stakes with some ludicrously incredible scenes and stunts. Oh, how I miss when effects movies had this kind of physicality and heft to them. Maybe someday we'll see them again, in some distant future. Segway. The future war stuff looks really cool, and it suspends disbelief well enough, but honestly, I think people get a little too hung up on the time travel and future war aspect of this movie, including many of the writers and directors of its sequels, in my opinion. To my mind, the future war stuff is of instrumental rather than intrinsic value to this movie. Cameron had that central, iconic image of the Terminator rising out of the fire, and he hung the movie around it. Cameron shows us just enough of this world to suspend disbelief without giving us too much detail. He does this because the point of showing us all this stuff in the first place is really to say that if we don't get a grip of ourselves, then our future is going to be really shit indeed. This movie is not about the minutiae of future timelines, paradoxes, and the technology of the Terminators themselves. It's a horror action movie about a relentless technological nightmare, and it's about our human characters' responses to it. In fact, I go as far as to say the Terminator doesn't have to be science fiction at all. The Terminator doesn't need to be a robot. Essentially, he's a figure that represents cold, hard reality. It represents war, famine, genocide, pestilence, and it represents the finality of death. If we're to believe the words of philosopher John Gray, the whole of human culture is an exercise in death denial. The Terminator in this movie is a figure who sledgehammers his way through this rickety facade. In this world of ineffectual cops, idiotic street punks and decadent club dwellers, our central characters are the only ones who seem to see the reality lying beneath the facade. And they fight for their lives, if not to overcome it, then simply to live to fight another day. Another work that by coincidence or design has quite a bit in common with the Terminator is the short story The Signalman by Charles Dickens. The Signalman follows an unnamed narrator's attempt to befriend a solitary rail worker who's plagued by a ghostly apparition whose continuous warnings lead to the rail worker's death. In this story, Dickens demonstrates the powerlessness of humanity in the face of technological advancement by interconnecting the supernatural to the mundanity of life during the industrial era. By attributing human qualities to the paranormal, Dickens effectively emphasizes the unforgiving brutality of industrial machinery. It's also another work that, at least in its televised form, hangs off one central, horrifying image. The Signalman and the Terminator were made more than 100 years apart, and yet they share a number of the same concerns. These concerns are still with us today, of course. Although outside of Hideo Nakata's original Ring movie, perhaps, I don't think I've ever seen the theme of technological horror delivered again with quite the same punch. For me, the element that elevates this movie above basically any other action sci-fi horror, including its sequel, I would argue, is its purity. That single, unconscious, horrific Jungian archetype of an image is a very powerful one indeed. It came to James Cameron in a fever dream. He didn't dissect or make up an overly elaborate or literal explanation for it. He recognized the power of that image. An unconscious image, something ineffable and more powerful than anything the conscious mind could conjure up. That image is the centerpiece of this movie, and in my humble opinion, that's the right way to go about creating stuff. Although the ending of the movie appears superficially quaint compared to a lot of today's sometimes willfully obtuse movie endings, it rang contrary to the vast majority of 1980s Hollywood special effects films. The end result of our main character's journey is at best inconclusive. Although the Terminator has been viciously squeezed to death, one of our lead characters has died, and the other is now going into hiding. Sarah Connor hasn't triumphed, she's survived, and become stronger and more resilient in the process. When she drives off into the Mexican hills, it's not a happily ever after, it's a tactical withdrawal. The storm is coming. We need to prepare, adapt, and to take stock. Looking at the giant shitstorm we're in the midst of at the moment, with war in Europe, a biting cost of living crisis, a destabilized geopolitical landscape, rapidly advancing artificial intelligence, and fucking really expensive video games consoles, that seems as sound a piece of advice today as it did in 1984.